Next, let's take a look at Vue Components. We have used this concept components quite a lot in the backend development, the server-side development. Can we use the same idea for front-end projects? The answer is yes. Over the past few years, web pages have become more and more dynamic and powerful thanks to JavaScript. We have moved so many responsibilities of the server side into front-end. A consequence is that the front-end has become very, very large. There are a lot of JavaScript code, maybe thousands of lines of code, connecting to various HTML and CSS files with no formal organization. So by using Vue Components, we can better organize the front-end project, so it is easier to develop and easier to maintain. What is a component for front-end? In Vue.js, a component is a reusable piece of code that includes HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that we can use in different Vue instances. Here's an example. On this page, we can assume there is a Vue instance. And in this instance is using 4 different Vue components. Now on a different page that we have a different Vue instance, let's say that instance wants to reuse header and navigation. They can just use the one that we defined in this Vue instance. So by using components, then we can reuse a component over and over. We can even organize those components in a component library that can reuse across different projects. Let me show you a quick introductory example in VS Code. In demo 1, we're going to define a button that can show how many times this button is being clicked. If you look at this code here, there are 2 divs. The first div with ID app1, second div with ID app2. That's right, we're going to create 2 Vue instances. So this one is taking over the first div, the second one is taking over the second div. So there are 2 Vue instances on this page. What I'm going to do is, in each Vue instance, I'm going to define this button that can show how many times it's being clicked. So what I can do here is in app1, I'm going to define button and also its behavior down here, then copy and paste into app2. It can show how many times it's being clicked. But this is not very flexible because I really want to create a reusable component. If you think about, we talk about componentization, increase reusability. So in this demo, I'm going to create a Vue component and have VM1, well, the first Vue instance, and VM2 use the same component. Define a new component called button counter. Here is the syntax. Vue.component. And we're going to pass 2 arguments to it. The first one is the name of this component. We call it button counter. It can be any name. The second argument is the detailed definition of this component. And here we're going to define how it looks, which the value of this template is a string of HTML. We have button, and also we have an onClick event is equal to increment. Later on, we're going to define this increment function method inside this component. And also, we're going to show something is clicked. Here we're using mustache notation, count times. And in the end, we're going to close it. So the value of template is a string of HTML. It defines how this component looks. The next part is we're going to define data, because a component is going to have its own data, internal data. In this case, the data is containing this count, how many times this button, this component is being clicked on. So it's very similar to how we define data in Vue instance, is we have data. The difference is we have to use a function to define this data. This function, we're going to return an object. And in here, we only have one data, which is count. Initially, it is 0, because when you first render this page, the button should say clicked 0 times. So that's the data. Next, I'm going to define the behavior of this component. I'm going to use methods. As you can see, this is very similar to Vue instance. So we only have one behavior, which is increment. Here is a function. And inside, we're going to refer to the count we define in data. So this dot count 1. So this dot count refers to the count we define in the data function. That's it. That's how we define a component. As you can see, the component has HTML, the component has its own data, the component has its own behavior. So we encapsulate everything into one solid component, and this component can be reused in different Vue instances. All right, so how do we use a component? So once we define it, remember we're going to use it in app 1 and app 2. It's very simple. We can use a component as a custom HTML tag. So what I mean is button counter. Now this is not a built-in HTML tag, but we can actually use this custom tag. And also I'm going to copy this and paste it in here, right? That's what I promised, defined once down here, and we can use it multiple times. Okay, if I make a change here, then both app 1 and app 2 will get the same change. Okay, so we don't have any duplicates here. All right, next, let me show you how it looks in the browser. So right-click, View in Browser. Okay, so this is app 1, this is app 2. So if I click here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm going to click this button in app 2, 1, 2, 3. So as you can see, clicking one button will not change the value of a different button because, even though they're both defined based on the same component, but they are really different instances. They have their own scope. So this button will not affect this button. Now let me show you the page elements in Google's developer tool. So I press F12. I'm under element. If I move my cursor here, I'm going to expand it. As you can see here, we have a button clicked 4 times. But where is my component tag? Remember, we have a component tag called button counter. It is not shown here. So what happened is that component will be compiled into regular pure HTML and displayed here. So in the elements here, you cannot see the Vue components. So those are just native or built-in tags. If you think of Vue component, the highlighted area here looks awfully like a Vue instance. You're right. A Vue component is actually a reusable Vue instance. So in this page, actually there are 4 Vue instances. There is a VM1, VM2, and we have 2 component instances here. So there are actually 4 Vue instances on the same page. Since components are reusable Vue instances, they accept the same options as new Vue instance like this. So you can define template, you can define data, you can define methods, and also watch, computed, and even lifecycle hooks like created and mounted. But I want to point out that when we define the button counter component here, you may have noticed that this data is defined as a function, not an object like in VM1 and VM2. Here in VM1 and VM2, data is an object, but here data is a function. So many beginners will make this mistake. In a component, data is a function. In a Vue instance, data is a JS object. So make sure everybody understands the difference. Okay, so the reason that we're using function here is that each component instance can maintain its own independent copy of the return value of the return data object. So if we don't have this return, then all the component instances will share the same count. So that means if I click one button, okay, like here, if I click one button, then both buttons will change the value. Okay, that's not what we want. We really want every component instance has its own scope, its own copy of count. So make sure that you're using function and return for the data in component. In front-end development, it is really common for an app to be organized into a tree of nested components like this. So first, this entire page is a component. And inside this component, we have 1, 2, and 3. There are 3 components here. Look at the gray area. And then in the second component, we have even more subcomponents, 2 more, and we have 3 more. So the modern front-end app is really a tree of nested components. I'm going to show you more examples later on, but just wanted you to know this pattern is how we organize a front-end development. So components can interact with each other through props, and we're also going to talk about this later on. And each component keeps its own HTML, CSS, and also data. That's the whole point. Before we move on to the next topic of Vue components, there's one small thing that bugs me when I define Vue component, that is the option template. So we know that the value of this template is a string, is a JS string. And in this string, basically is HTML, right? But you guys know how painful it is to define HTML code or program HTML code inside a string. The disadvantage here is we have to define everything in one line. So for example, in this case, normally what we do is we're going to use 3 lines. So the first line is the button here. Then the second line is the content. Then the third line is we close it. And we also have the indentation, so it looks very nice visually, right? But I cannot do it here because here, if I press enter, I just want to break it and go to the next line, that breaks the string. Because in JS, you can only define one single string on one line, right? You cannot define one single string on different lines. So what we have to do is, first I'm going to break it here. Okay, so break it here and break it here. And then go here, break and break. And use plus to concatenate them. Now in this case, we can do it like this, right? And also, what about indentation? We can do this. Space, 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 space. All right, then we have 3 JS strings. Now once we put them together, that's one string. But we have those plus, so we have to constantly break in, break out. So this is really a painful experience, right? JavaScript provides an awesome feature called template literals so that we can define a string on multiple lines. So how do we do this? So let's go all the way back. Okay, so what we do here is instead of using this single quote, we're going to use backtip. Now you can find backtip on your top left corner of your keyboard. All right, so it's not complaining, right? So then I can break them. So now it looks much better, right? From now on, when I define template in a component, I will no longer use single quote, but I will use template literals. It's a new feature in ES6.